Today, Dr. Reni Kaunda is going to be presenting. He is an assistant professor in mining engineering at Colorado School of Mines and a licensed professional engineer. He holds a Bachelor's of Science and Master of Science degrees from the University of Arizona and a PhD from Western Michigan University. Prior to joining academia, Dr. Kaunda spent time in the mining industry where he worked on more than 50 global projects throughout Africa, Asia, South America, and North America. Dr. Kaunda has performed or coordinated projects related to mining geotechnics in surface and underground mines, and has also been actively involved in organizing and chairing national and international conferences and short courses. He has published, co-authored more than 50 peer-reviewed technical papers, conference proceedings, abstracts, and professional reports. Dr. Kaunda is also the host on the SME documentary, Iron in Our Electrical World. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaunda.
Thank you very much for the introduction. For those of you who listened to last week's talk, it's quite a hard talk to follow, following Doug Silver's talk last week. So those of you who missed that talk, I encourage you to check it out on the departmental website. It was a really, really great talk. All right, one last check. Everybody on Zoom, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. So I can't see questions in the chat box. So I suspect somebody from the audience is going to be monitoring what's going on in the chat box for questions later on. Okay, so my talk is titled, What's Lab Got to Do with It? Environmental Impacts of Mining in Sub-Sahara Africa. So the outline of my talk, first I'm going to talk about why mining is important. Then I'll talk about the impacts of mining on the environment. Then I'll talk about why we need to assess the environmental impacts of mining in that region specifically. Then I'm going to talk about what I call ghosts of Christmas past, and we'll see what that means. Then finally, I'll conclude with what's lab got to do with it. Okay, so if you only take away one point from this talk, from this discussion, the takeaway point is that it's possible to care deeply about the environment and care deeply about mining. They are not mutually exclusive. So there is a point of intersection where you can do both, where you care deeply about the environment and love mining as well. So if you only take away one point from this talk, that's the takeaway point. I can only cover so much in 45 minutes. So for the students who are in this room and those who are on Zoom, if you've not taken my class, Mine, Water, and Environment, I offer that class every fall. And so some of the points that I'm going to cover in this class are discussed in detail when I offer that class in the fall. Please, I ask you to mute yourself. Those who are on Zoom. Okay, so several acknowledgements and all protocols observed. So I would like to acknowledge our partners, our collaborators, our sponsors from Mines, the University of Zambia, Arizona State University, Georgia College State University, and the Penn Institute for Public Policy. However, any errors or misspeak that will be presented at this talk, that will be my full responsibility. I take full responsibility of that. In addition, I'm going to break one of the rules that I usually give my grad students every time they give their presentation. So this talk is a little bit unconventional in the sense that it does not necessarily have a hypothesis and a methodology and results and findings and future recommendations. It's essentially a report on ongoing work and some remarks on my observations about this topic. So it's essentially futuristic. Most of the results are going to be presented in the future. All right. So let's start. Why is mining important? Well, it's like preaching to the choir for such an audience. Essentially, we have a growing population globally. Okay, so if you look at this chart that I present over here, you can see that from the 60s until 2010, there's been an accelerated growth in the world population. That comes with a consequence. So the consequence is that there's going to be an increase in the raw materials that are used by the increasing global population. Okay, so raw materials, you're talking about mineral resources, you're talking about energy, you're talking about water, etc. Okay. In addition, there's also been an increase in the global domestic products of several countries. So that means everybody is trying to strive to go towards the middle class or higher. So they are demand for larger items as well, right? Vehicles, phones, etc. is also going to go up, driving the demand for raw materials from the earth. Okay, so this chart here shows the raw materials that have been used since the early 1900s to right around 2010. So these depressions that you see indicate periods when there's been a recession, okay? But as you can see, they've been temporary in nature, meaning that the general long-term trend is upward, and that is not going to slow down anytime soon, whether it's because of COVID or any other calamities. The issue is that the general long-term trend in terms of the use of raw materials is upward, and that is going to increase. So what that implies is that for the mining industry, there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of jobs for students who are in mining. We're going to see a gap in terms of the workforce as this demand for raw materials continues going up. Here are some examples. So this table shows you the weight and value of metals, for example, in cell phones, right? So you can see this copper, silver, gold, and how much material is used in technologies such as cell phone. Look at the metals and the minerals that are present in cars, right? Those are also abundant, right? You're talking about iron, steel, aluminum, etc., right? So your average vehicle has a lot of metals and minerals that are used, which all come from mining. Mining is really important. We can say the same thing about cell phones as well. Talk about renewables, right? Such as wind turbines. The amount of metals and things that come from mining are also significant. Your average wind turbine uses over 300 tons of steel, 5 tons of copper, etc., right? So you can see that you cannot talk about renewable energy without talking about the resources that come from mining. Energy, okay? So this pie chart shows you a distribution of the sectors, the energy sectors, and the source of energy. For example, we see nuclear, 5.8%, bioenergy and renewables, about 10%, gas, 21%, coal, 27%. Look at the significant role played by coal, okay? So even though we've seen a shift away from the use of coal in energy, it's not going away anytime soon, because there's going to be a gap that needs to be filled if you remove coal from the picture. As illustrated by this chart, on the left-hand side here, you see the net electricity generation by a category. So there's coal right there. You see the renewables at the bottom, right, from 2000 to 2016. There's a huge gap between what is coming from our renewables is going up, but there's still a significant gap that would need to be filled if coal were to be completely eliminated. The right-hand chart shows us the coal production, and you can see it's been going down over the years, primarily driven by costs, right? As other alternatives have been sourced. In addition, of course, to the adverse impacts on the environment. All right. So mining is important. We need mining. We can all agree that we need mining, whether it's for resources or whether it's for energy. However, there's also the other side of the coin. If done irresponsibly, mining can have adverse impacts on the environment. Okay, so what sort of adverse impacts are we talking about? Well, it depends. So this is the mineral resource development cycle or the mine life cycle. You can talk about exploration, you talk about construction of the mine, the facility before you start producing and mining, and then ultimately closure. So each stage of the life cycle is going to produce some environmental impacts that are associated with the surrounding environment. This chart here talks about extraction to processing. At each of those different stages, you can see that there's a significant amount of waste that's being generated, whether we're talking about waste rock during the drilling, blasting, generating waste rock. Where are you going to site that rock? Where are you going to place it? How are you going to make sure that it does not adversely impact your water, your soil, your vegetation? If you go down to mineral concentrates, you are generating tailings, right? That's been in the news recently with tailing storage facilities failing and having significant impacts on surrounding communities. Refining has slag as well. And so especially in Africa, that's a huge problem. We find these dumps of slag that need to be stored properly and addressed. So when you're talking about environmental impacts of mining, you are looking at land disturbance by the nature of mining, right? You have to dig up the earth. Of course, if you are using a method that is surface-based, surface mining, it's even much more significant than, say, underground mining, where you have relatively less land developed. Surface and groundwater pollution is another concern. Okay, so if you are looking at, for example, materials that are likely to generate acidity, such as sulfides, for example, that becomes another potential impact. Soil contamination, destruction of natural habitats for wildlife, noise pollution in some areas that are located near neighborhoods or close to communities, that is also an environmental concern. So there are several potential challenges and opportunities for the students as engineers to derive solutions that can help prevent some of these potential environmental impacts. The problem or the challenge is compounded by the fact that as we've mined over the years, as the demand for raw materials has increased, we've exhausted or nearly exhausted all the resources that are easy to access, right? So these are things that are close to the surface or that are in geological conditions that are easy to engineer around and design and extract, okay? The other challenge is not only access, but the grade has also been going down. So what that means is that if the grade has gone down of the metals that we're interested in, for example, a relatively large amount of waste material, waste rock is associated with that decreasing concentration of mineral, right? So for example, in the US and Canada, mining generates 20 times the amount of solid waste that's generated by other establishments. So that is pretty significant. Another issue is the demand of water and energy. Okay, so mining by its nature consumes a lot of water, consumes a lot of energy due to fragmentation, breaking rock, processing, etc. And it is estimated that mines around the world, not just the extraction part, but the processing part, consumes approximately 5 to 10% of the energy, which mostly comes from fossil fuels for hydroelectricity. So each of those are separate sectors, industry sectors, which have their own associated impacts on the environment, right? So we're not only looking at the direct environmental impacts from mining, but we're also looking at the affiliated industries where mining obtains its energy needs and its water needs as well. So there are a series of factors that influence these impacts. It depends on what sort of methods you are using, the local conditions, what is the climate, what is the rock, what is the topography. However, the common denominator is that most of the adverse impacts are going to come from the wastes that are generated through the extraction process itself or the downstream processes in terms of mineral processing. Okay, so that's the background, that's the introduction. So why should we care about assessing the environmental impacts, specifically in Sub-Sahara Africa? Well, the first reason that I submit is the concept borrowed from economics, this idea of governing the commons. So Elena Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2009 for her work on this concept of governing the commons. So before she came along, the general thinking was this idea of tragedy of the commons. So what that means, basically, and I'm not an economist, is that if you have a resource that is limited and you have a community utilizing that resource, each individual is going to try to maximize their use of that limited resource. And ultimately, as each individual tries to maximize their utilization of that resource, it becomes actually bad for the community collectively, right? They eventually run out of whatever that resource is. Could be water, could be a mineral deposit, right? Could be farming land. However, following her work in the, I believe, 60s and 70s, and a lot of field work, Elena actually discovered that that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. Communities can actually self-organize to start using their resources responsibly, such that it's beneficial in the long term without depleting that resource. And for her work, she won the Nobel Prize for Economics, I believe, 2009. So you can see work done in the 60s, 70s, Nobel Prize 2009. So to the students, I want to say to you that sometimes your work may not have an immediate payoff right now. It may take years before your work is significant and makes an impact, right? So don't feel bad if nobody's recognizing your work or your hard work. Well, so that's why we need to assess the environmental impact in this region, because we need to have an understanding of what exactly are we looking at? What are the potential issues that we're likely to run into if we're gonna govern the commons? Africa has about 1.54 billion people, and that is expected to keep growing and expanding by 2100 to be densely populated. This map here shows you the distribution of different populations. This area in purple, that is what is called Sub-Sahara Africa, and it's basically below this the Sahara, the southern boundary of the Sahara Desert. That's West Africa. There's Southern Africa, and so forth. The brown areas show you the most densely populated zones. Okay, so that means that in these areas, if there are resources, you're gonna have to talk about how do we govern the commons? How do we utilize those resources in such a way that is environmentally friendly. In addition, a lot of these countries depend on mining, right? So mining is a huge contributor to their gross domestic products, okay? As we start seeing the increased interest in the energy transition and utilization of rare earths, for instance, mining is just going to become even much more significant and something to contend with. For example, in Zambia, between 2009 and 2012, about 49 companies only paid $50.4 million towards environmental rehabilitation when the target was 226.7 million, okay? So that is nothing, that is not gonna clean up anything. Case example, Western Australia, the costs that were related to rehabilitation and closure in 2010 were between 3 billion and 5 billion, okay? That is significant to do closure and reclamation properly. In Zimbabwe, a study conducted showed that on 4 large decommissioned mines, the cost was going to be $32 million, right? So again, it's not really clear whether that's an accurate figure to conduct a comprehensive, effective rehabilitation. Just example, South Africa has over 6,000 abandoned mines, and for one mine, it cost about $0.24 million, which was only 5 hectares, which is a relatively small area, right? In Zambia, a land area of 9,125 hectares is estimated to have about 791 million tons of tailings from historic mining activities. And there's still much more coming, okay? So as you can see, a lot of this area has historically not been closed properly or rehabilitated properly. And there are huge amounts of land that have a lot of mine waste products. In addition, there's also artisanal mining going on. How many of these artisanal miners do you think actually practice measures that protect the environment and their communities? None, right? They tend to be to work in very harsh conditions, hazardous conditions, usually with very little training, and their activities are not only impacting the site that they are working on, but also the surrounding communities, right? Due to climate factors, for example. There's a lot of wind in Zambia, for example, and studies have shown that some of the contaminants from the historic sites can be found often 50 to 150 kilometers away from the specific site where the mining and processing is taking place. In addition, in certain places and neighborhoods, they rely on agriculture. So they grow crops like corn and cassava. And previous studies have indicated that some of those crops actually are contaminated with heavy metals such as lead, zinc, and so forth. So when they did a study where they measured the lead levels, for example, in children, they found extremely high levels as a result of the dust particles that those kids were breathing, and some of the food intake and the livestock as well. So that becomes, again, a food security issue, right? So those are impacts from historic activities. So if mining is going to go up, going to keep going up, is there a way, are there methods that can be deployed that can avoid all such adverse impacts, okay? Another reason why it's important to assess the impact on the environment is because of the lack of adequate environmental governance to correct historic problems and to make sure that they are not repeated in the future. The sad thing is that typically most mining companies in that area, in that region of the world, do not self-report, right? So usually it takes an activist or other stakeholders to identify problems and then bring them up for discussion. Okay, so there are a lot of resources in Africa of different types of minerals, including critical minerals. So this map just shows you where some of those are located, and you can see a close relationship between some of those densely populated regions that I showed in Sub-Sahara Africa and the location of some of these minerals of interest, right? So the problem is worthy of investigation and discussion. All right, let's talk about critical minerals. So critical minerals are important, have been defined by the US government. So those are minerals that are vital to the nation's security and economic prosperity, and their disruption in supply chains and so forth could impact the independence of the US in those areas. So these methods are typically rare, right? And they are found in only specific places. All right, copper is important. Some people debate whether it's a critical mineral or not, but because of the energy transition and the demand for copper, we've seen that becoming clearly a critical mineral issue. All right, so this shows a plot of the impact of supply restriction versus supply risk. Let's look at copper, for example. This is the production of copper from the mid-2000s to 2014 to projected to 2035. And the projection by the World Bank is that this gap is just going to keep going up, right? There's not just going to be enough supply on the market to meet the demand for copper, right? So again, that means that we are talking about a resource that's going to be restricted, and the principles of economics again come into play, where we have to talk about how do we share a limited resource responsibly without adversely impacting the environment. Second reason, why should we assess environmental impacts? There is something in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Basically, talks about if you had, let's say you give students an exam or a test, and I know I'm oversimplifying it. The high performers, we usually think that they performed poorer than they actually performed on the exam. And conversely, the relatively lower performing students who tend to think they performed higher than they did. And actually that phenomenon has been observed in a lot of areas, in a lot of applications when it comes to competency measures. So in the case of environmental studies and environmental impacts, sometimes there tends to be this belief that we actually know or understand the impacts on the environment of what we are doing, right? However, our study from this paper that was published in 2020 showed the case, using the example case of lithium, that there's actually very limited understanding of the impacts of lithium mining and processing on the environment. The demand for lithium is expected to reach 2.2 million tons by 2030. However, there's going to be a significant deficit. Because of the deficit, this is going to drive a lot of exploration and looking for lithium around the world. However, this is 2022. We only have about 8 years, right? Before we start experiencing this deficit. Our understanding on the environmental impacts of lithium is extremely limited. For example, there are some estimates that say that about 95% of water is lost when you are extracting lithium from brines in South America. And some have tagged water consumption at 500,000 gallons per ton of lithium that is extracted, which is extremely significant, okay? And studies in Australia show that 98% of 3,300 tons of waste was not recycled that was produced as a result of the mining process. Then the Chilean government says that between 2000 and 2015, the amount of water that was pumped out during the extraction process increased by about 21%, resulting in depleted groundwater resources in the region, okay? So if we look at this case study or this idea that our current understanding of just looking at one critical mineral, lithium, is very limited, right? Yet we think that our understanding of potential future impacts of extraction of critical minerals is understood, then there's a gap there, right? We need to make sure that we are not being overconfident of what we know, what we don't know. The third reason why we need to do environmental assessment of these future mining activities in that region is because we have the tools that are available, right? Such as Exergy Analysis. So the idea of Exergy is closely tied to the second law of thermodynamics, right? So this law of thermodynamics, energy cannot created or destroyed, it's conserved in a closed system. However, that's the scientific definition. So if we're talking about the practical aspects of energy, we are interested in useful energy, energy that actually does work, energy that can be quantified, that is practical, right? So you cannot say if you fill in your, if you fill in gasoline in your vehicle, right, you are using that energy, you are paying dollars for it, right? So there's a certain tangible energy that you're dealing with that is actually causing your vehicle to move from point A to point B. So that portion of the useful, tangible, practical energy is exergy. And this idea of exergy analysis has been successfully applied in emissions control and improving technology and making sure that systems are efficient. So such tools can be deployed in understanding the potential impacts of mining in the extraction and processing of some of these critical minerals. Life cycle analysis is also an extremely useful tool that can be applied. The challenge, however, becomes in assigning numbers and values to the different units that are involved in the process of conducting the life cycle analysis itself and the associated products. So the tools are there to be used, and that's why we should certainly go for assessing environmental impacts. All right, so now I'm gonna show quickly a few examples of environmental impacts that were not good in that area, in that region. So this is a lead mine site, mining and processing. It was mined in Zambia at a place called Kabwe. The mine closed in the mid-90s without proper environmental rehabilitation and closure. There are a lot of communities in that area. A lot of children play in the vicinity of these dumps. People scavenge for lead and zinc to sell, as shown in that figure by this gentleman. So the same area shows you the distribution of contaminants. So the red indicates where the mining activities and processing were taking place. And as I mentioned, as you advance away from this area, you can see trace contaminants of heavy metals. So this one shows lead. You can see this area shows you 600 parts per million. That area shows you 1800 parts per million. And as you get closer, the concentrations of lead in the soil sediments even increases. For comparison's sake, or for reference sake, let's look at the water in Flint, Michigan, when there was that uproar in Outer, and when people were, when everything was on the news, right? So the levels measured in the water in Flint, Michigan was 0.027 parts per million. Okay, the standard permissible lead is 0.005 parts per million. Now look at these figures compared to the outrage in Flint, Michigan. That is just mind-blowing, right? It gets worse, right? So about 25% of the kids in this neighborhood who were tested for lead in their blood, they had levels of much greater than 0.65 parts per million of lead was found in their blood. In certain cases, 3 parts per billion, right? So this is a huge, huge concern in that area, right? So the World Bank has been working in that area. I visited that site this past summer, and there are a lot of projects that are going on related to characterization and efforts for remediation and so forth. This is an example of acid rock drainage in South Africa. As I mentioned, there are over 6,000 abandoned mines in South Africa that were not properly rehabilitated or closed. And this is not unusual to see, very close again to communities and neighborhoods. It's a significant problem when we talk about not only impacts on surface water, but also local aquifer systems as well. This is Ghana, in the western part of Ghana. So again, there's been a lot of adverse impacts on surface water and groundwater. And some of that water is the source for domestic and other uses as a result of artisanal small-scale mining activities. So again, artisanal small-scale mining throughout Sub-Sahara Africa, Sub-Sahara Africa comes with other associated problems and challenges, including exploitation of women, lack of governmental policies that protect the people or children, child labor, high crime, conflict over land use and water rights, promoting illegal immigration from neighboring countries, absence of legal framework, lack of education as a result of these historic and ongoing mining activities, okay? There have been discussions of, can this be formalized, right? Can this be an economic activity where the locals are trained, right, in terms of employing safety measures and so forth to protect them. All right, so now we come to the title of the topic as the conclusion. So what's lab got to do with it, right? How is this related to everything that we discussed? Well, as I mentioned, these are my remarks and just my observations. So there are different definitions of love, right? Depending on who you talk to. Love sometimes has been identified with empathy or kindness. I always love this saying. It says, you never know what someone is going through. Be kind always, right? Especially to students. Be kind to each other and be showing empathy, show support, you know, if your fellow student is struggling with something. In our context, I started with the takeaway point that it's possible to be passionate about the environment and mining without the two being mutually exclusive. But I also want you to think about a third component about the people, right? The people component. Can this element come into the mix as well, where we have this intersection where we care deeply about the environment, we love mining and its technologies and the methods that we're going to use, all these grand challenges in mining, in the mining industry, as well as care about the people that are impacted, whether we're talking about the communities or whether we're talking about other stakeholders, the mine employees, right? Even our shareholders, etc. Yes, the answer is yes. I think you can do all three. You can care deeply about the environment, care deeply about mining, and also care about the people. So in the background that I've laid out, I've talked about the historic nature of the environmental impact in Sub-Sahara Africa, but that's not enough. We shouldn't just talk about the problems or all these adverse impacts, right? What are we going to do about it, right? Is there something we can do today? That's the question that I submit before you. And it's so easy to feel overwhelmed and to say, wow, you know, there are billions and billions of people in that area. What can one person do? What can one individual do in that area, right? But it all begins with one small step at a time. So we decided to, well, before I talk about what we decided to do, I want to show you this. So this shows you, this chart talks about different math skills from elementary school through high school, college, and finally the job, right? So we learn about counting, basic operations, geometry, algebra. We start advancing our math skills. We talk about trigonometry, calculus, differential equations, et cetera. But then when you start working, what you end up using mostly Excel, right? You find you use a lot of Excel and stuff. So the takeaway point from this chart, I don't know where this came from, that sometimes actually simple solutions are very effective in life, as observed in a lot of careers, in a lot of engineering careers. So the solution doesn't have to be big, it can be simple, right? It can be such a simple solution. What can I do today that I don't feel overwhelmed? So our collaborators, me and my collaborators, we decided to try one thing, which was the idea based on using plants to remediate some of the historically contaminated sites, starting with Zambia. So this is a previous study that was done in 2015, where they identified several sites with contaminants, and the plants that were classified as hyperaccumulators. So hyperaccumulators are plants that can concentrate heavy metals without experiencing the toxicity, without being affected adversely by the toxicity of the heavy metals. So there's this plant, for example, the Kaunda plant, it's been found to actually accumulate a lot of copper. And so this just shows some of the analysis, the geochemical analysis that was done to see the stem where the different metals were located, copper, zinc, lead, etc., and so forth. So the project that we are doing right now, I'm going to take a bunch of students every year during the summer and try to find those plants at different sites and their potential for serving as hyperaccumulators in the country of Zambia at several historic mining sites. So this year, we're already full, but if you're interested, come and see me. We have plans to take additional students and next year and beyond. So we basically go out to different sites and look at the historic mining activities that were done at those different sites, study the materials that are there, their geochemistry, the plants that serve best in that area, and exploring whether those plants, after they've accumulated the heavy metals, can be used to produce biofuels. So this is a study that I was involved in a couple of years ago, where we are looking at food crops, using food crops in different communities and their potential for producing biofuels, right? So one step at a time, right? You cannot eat an elephant at once, but little tiny bites at a time. Eventually you start chipping away at whatever challenge you may be facing. All right, so I conclude with this quote from Nelson Mandela, who said that as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. Okay, so I challenge the students not only to identify problems, not only to characterize mechanisms of how things work or coming up with, cool technologies, but how can we actually make a difference in the communities that are experiencing the problems that we are trying to solve. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any questions? Or comments as well? Yeah.
Question. I want to firstly try to commend the beautiful work, and I really appreciate that. Thank you very much, because a lot of things have been in this seminar. I have one question and one comment. My question, firstly, is that Nigeria is one of is the most populous Black country in the world, and your study about Sub-Saharan Africa, there is not so much work done about Nigeria, because I know that we have a lot of mining impacts in Nigeria, some environment there. I'm quite sure we have a lot of adverse impact of mining in the environment. I don't know if your work is going to cover that environment. And the comment I just want to make is about energy transition, because the chart showed us a larger portion occupied by coal. And now that we're running away from coal, you said there is a large gap. And it's still the US, their planning is like they want to do a sudden change, a sudden transition. Looking at that large gap, how possible would that transition?
Thank you very much for your questions. Very good questions. First question, do we plan to look at Nigeria? Well, as I mentioned, the environmental impacts of historic mining activities in Africa, they are very extensive, and they certainly affect large areas. However, you gotta start somewhere. And so this project essentially is that first step, in trying to see, can we use a microcosm, a lab, so to say, where I see how effective this process is, and can that be extrapolated to other areas, not just in Sub-Sahara Africa, but other places in the world as well that have been adversely impacted by historic mining activities, and change the way mining is done in the future. Yeah, so there's certainly room to look at other areas as well. The second question is not an easy question. So as you have identified, currently there's a significant portion of energy that comes from coal, right? And so that's why in my remarks and my observations, I said that it is not easy for coal to go away right now as we transition towards renewables, just because of the current contribution in energy generation in the sector. Yeah,
I had a question. It was on the lead concentration in the soil. Do you know what the lead concentration? I think I saw a lake on that map. Do you know the lead concentration in the water versus soil? Obviously, it's hard to know off the top of your head.
I do not recall if there's a lake in that area, but there are certainly streams and small rivers. I don't remember from the top of my head what the concentration of the lead was in the water. However, it is seasonal, so meaning that in the rain season when there's a lot of moisture, the levels tend to go up. Then the dry season they tend to go down due to fluctuation in the groundwater elevation. We are looking at a study potentially with the USGS to do a more detailed groundwater characterization near that historic site as well to better understand those dynamics.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Actually, another one I'm going to cut in. The hyperaccumulator plants, are those native to like the mine sites, or are they potentially, how do you look at the biodiversity component of hyperaccumulators if you're going to factor that in, or do they pose risks to the environment by bringing in invasive species?
Good question. Yeah, so the idea is to target native species so that you don't bring in, invasion by the foreign plants as well, but also trying to investigate how one plant from site A performs when transported to plant B as well. So those are the sort of issues that we'll be looking at during our project, our research project. Steve.
Good presentation. I was going to pick up on the same issue in terms of you can't compare soil lead values with water because apples and oranges. So I'm glad you're going to do some work to figure that out. The comment I wanted to make here is that you and I talked last week or whenever when I came back from the feeds conference that the U.S. Army had done. And it seems to me there's a lot of potential for the use for applications of hemp and the as well as the natural ones as well. And you kind of point that out as great opportunity, very much in line with the work.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Yeah, there are a lot of studies that have been done looking at different plants that maybe we don't even look at in terms of their potential for remediating some of these mine wastes. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the idea of adding a lot about diversity commons and what ideas should be learned from the industry or the university educating engineers for the industry to bring them to the present? Like, what should we learn from that perspective of governing the commons and the mining industry to change the mindset?
Great question. That's a fantastic question. That's not an easy question, I think. Like I also my students in my classes that, we do a great job as universities in general in training our students to be great engineers, great innovators and so forth. But I feel like where the university education system could improve or could do things better is especially that aspect. Like how do we train our students to talk about some of these social issues, some of these community issues in terms of coming up with solutions that collectively benefit not just the community, but maybe think of a company or think of a department or think of an office and so forth. Right? Those interpersonal skills and negotiating and empathy, showing kindness, right, to others and so forth. Yeah, but there's certainly a research opportunity in that area of training and educating our engineers so that they are not only competent technological aspects, but as well as those people-related issues. Great question. Are there questions on Zoom? I've been looking at the chat.
Any in the chat. I've been keeping an eye on it. They can hear us clearly though.
Oh, that's great. Great. More questions?
If not, we all know how to reach Dr. Kaunda.
I have a question. Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm calling in. I'm just wondering about some of these legacy environmental problems that you pointed out in the Kabwe mine. Many of these operations are historic, and many of the environmental problems that you list are, of course, go back maybe in that instance 100 years. How do you handle the long-term liability of aging mines, and who's going to bear the cost of the rehabilitation, reclamation of those aging mines? Somebody has to do it. Is it a legacy cost from the original mine owner, which may be out of business or may have surrendered that mine to the government, as often has been the case in Zambia with ZCCM? I've just always wondered about what happens to try to mitigate or address some of these historic environmental problems. I'm a lawyer, not a geologist, so I'm asking you as a lawyer.
Thank you. That's a great question. I really like that question. And that is the challenge right there. You just put your thumb on the issues that are and the dynamics that that come into play when you're looking at these legacy sites. The quick answer is the taxpayers. Basically, the government has taken over most of these legacy sites in terms of cleanup, with the assistance of foundations, donors, the World Bank, etc. Both private and governmental entities are involved in the handling and rehabilitation of some of these historic sites, such as the Kabwe site. Any other questions?
All right, let us thank our speaker again. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.